All right, I think we can get started here. And as people come in, you can share where you're tuning in from across the state, and maybe mention your name as well. So I started to record this session, and we will be sharing the link in the recording online with participants and others who were not able to make it today. So stay tuned for that information. So my name is Pamela Hargis. I'm a horticulture professional with the Maine Cooperative Extension in Cumberland County. I will be moderating this webinar today along with Marjorie Peranto, who is an extension educator based out of Hancock and Washington counties. So today we're going to be talking about invasive plant management. And so I know some people joined us this morning to talk about ecology and ID, and we'll be kind of getting into the nitty-gritty of management practices. So I'm excited to introduce Nancy Olmstead today. She is an invasive plant biologist with the Maine Department of Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry. Nancy coordinates the iMaplnvasives online mapping program, conducts a lot of outreach to raise awareness about invasive plants and documentation of plants across the state, and really does some amazing work here in Maine. And before I hand it off to her, I just want to mention a few of the Zoom webinar components that we are using today. So many of you have participated in the chat already, which is great. Throughout the presentation today, you can ask your questions through the Q&A function, which is down at the bottom of your screen, probably kind of towards the bottom right-hand corner. When you click on that, you can enter in a question that you have. All the questions will be available so that you can see what other people are asking. And so we'll try to answer them based on how they come in. And just pay attention to the questions because there might be some overlap there in what people are asking. We'll do our best to get to all the questions. There will likely be lingering questions. So towards the end, we'll start sharing some contact information and talk a little bit about who you can reach out to with some of your specific questions. So with that said, I'll hand it over to Nancy. Thank you, Nancy, for doing this.
It's my pleasure. Thank you, Pamela, for the invitation and for hosting. And I'm going to go ahead and share my PowerPoint and start my slideshow here. Great. So Pamela, can you just confirm with a thumbs up that you can see my first title slide? Great, thank you. Yeah, so as Pamela said, we're here to talk about invasive plant management today. Thanks to everyone who is perhaps rejoining after attending the morning webinar on plant identification and ecology. So many different ways to manage invasive plants. This is on the left, a photograph of some hardy volunteers who showed up in February, I believe it was, to help manage plants at Two Lights State Park with Kurt, the park manager, raising his brush saw high. And on the right, that's me with my backpack sprayer treating some Japanese barberry on one of the state public reserve lands. So we'll talk about a variety of different approaches from hand tools to goats. So here we go. I work at the Department of Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry. You might be able to see our fancy, relatively new logo on my shirt. We're a big department, and my office is the Maine Natural Areas Program, where our mission is to ensure the maintenance of Maine's natural heritage for present and future generations. So most of my office focuses on some of these rare plants and high quality habitats. And because invasive plants are a threat to those habitats, and because our office specializes in botany, in plants, we created the invasive plant program. And as Pamela mentioned, I do a lot of outreach. I do survey and management of invasive plants on state of Maine properties. And I also coordinate an iMaplnvasives online mapping tool, which I'll tell you a little bit more about later. So that's where I'm kind of representing today, my office. And if you're wondering, what are invasive plants? How do they get here? Why are they harmful? What impacts do they have? I encourage you to watch the recording of this morning's webinar, which will be available online pretty soon, I think, in the next couple of days. And I think Pam can share a link of where that would be found in the chat box. So at this time, I'd like to do a quick poll to find out a little bit more about who's on the webinar. Pamela, if you could help me by launching the question that asks folks kind of to describe themselves, we'll learn a little bit more about what kind of, who is represented on the poll. Great, so I'm seeing the poll pop up on my screen that's asking which of the following best describes you, and you can choose more than one if that is the case for you. And we'll give this a little while for folks to vote. We've got 35%, 40% of folks voting. Just give this another minute or two, or until everybody votes, which this question is flying by. We have 85% of folks who have now voted about your what describes you, whether you are a residential homeowner, family forest landowner, farmer, gardener, etc. Great. So it looks like we have a lot of residential homeowners on the webinar today. Welcome to you. Glad to be providing this for you. Home gardeners and some land stewardship folks, natural resources professionals also. A few teachers and students. Welcome to all of you. Thanks for telling us a little bit more about yourself. Great. Okay. So I'm going to advance to my next slide. Which shows you kind of my key steps in addressing invasive plants. So over the years, I've kind of tried to distill this into 5 steps, and then parentheses, repeat. So we start by preventing new introductions. Then, you know, when you are looking at your own property or at a particular site, we encourage you to identify what plants are present, assess how much and where are they, and report using a tool like iMaplnvasives. You have to usually we have to prioritize our actions because we often don't have enough resources to address every invasive plant on every acre of land that we might be managing. Then we have to control them. We have to get out there and actually try to kill some plants. And we monitor those sites where we have taken action, and we repeat this process. It's kind of a cyclical process. You know, we don't have a lot of silver bullets in terms of dealing with invasive plants. So we always need to monitor and repeat our actions. So we'll go through this process in detail, starting with how do we prevent new introductions? And really the key way that we do this is we use caution when stuff is moved. And that sounds a bit vague. So what do I mean? Well, we're talking about plant seeds or fragments that could be moved in a variety of situations. So starting at the top left, this photograph shows a gentleman on a mowing machine. And when equipment is brought to a property that can transport seeds or fragments, there's lots of nooks and crannies in the equipment, and that can accidentally spread the problem. When plants are brought for landscaping or for farming, those can carry, unfortunately, hitchhikers with them, or they themselves might be a problem plant. So soil that comes with plants can carry those hitchhiking seeds or fragments. So that's another area of caution. We ourselves, in the top right here, showing the boots and the pet, we ourselves can be a vector or a mode of transmission for invasive plants. And so as we recreate, we can take caution by cleaning off the mud from our boots and doing a once over on our pets to make sure that no sticky seeds are attached to the fur or our pant legs. So that's something that we can take ownership of as recreationalists, particularly right now while we are making great use of our parks and other conserved lands to get outside and refresh our spirits in this pandemic world. Take a little extra time to knock the mud off your boots before you're leaving your natural area and going to the next location. When things like hay are moved around, or also manure or mulch, those can be contaminated with invasive plant seeds or fragments. And so this is a case where you really kind of have to monitor the location where those materials are on your property to make sure nothing unwanted is sprouting up, and that we can nip that in the bud if we do find something undesirable. The skidder equipment here that might come to your property for a timber harvest could also carry mud or fragments of plants in the nooks and crannies of the equipment. So as a best practice, a family forest owner could ask a logger to please clean the equipment before it arrives at your property. And you might encourage the logger to clean the equipment before it leaves your property, especially if you know that you have invasive plants in the area of the harvest. But even if you're not sure, it's just kind of a good hygiene practice to clean the equipment. You know, sometimes it could be as simple as knocking off the mud with a shovel or a broom. In some situations, it might need more specialized equipment like a air pressure gun or pressurized water. But sometimes this doesn't actually have to take extra fancy equipment. It's just a matter of taking a little bit of time. And so, you know, we as landowners can ask our service providers to do this for us. And, you know, there might be additional costs associated with that, but it's our way of making sure that we're being good stewards, both of our own properties and also neighboring properties where the equipment might be traveling to or from. So that's something that we can do. In the lower right-hand photo, you're seeing the movement of water, and we can't really prevent water moving in the landscape, nor is it desirable to do so in many cases. So we just have to be aware on our properties or properties that we manage of where there's flowing water and keep an eye on those locations for any new establishment of undesirable plants. So again, you know, being present on the land is important, and trying to notice what plants are growing where. And then fill. So this is a photograph of a culvert replacement with this surveyor or construction worker standing here. And so when we have road work done, when any kind of fill material is brought to a property, that could carry invasive plant seeds or fragments. And so again, monitoring those locations so that if anything does come in, it can be treated immediately is very important. And I focused here on those movement opportunities that are really human mediated. Of course, many invasive plants are moved by wildlife, and so that's not something that we can control per se. I know that, you know, deer and turkeys and birds and other mammals, rodents can move seeds around, and to the great extent that's out of our control. But something to just be aware of also as we think about invasive plants. So that's really a snapshot about prevention. It's obviously important when you're managing an invasive plant to be able to identify it. And for those of you who are feeling great about identification, terrific. I encourage anyone who needs a refresher to pick up a copy of the Maine Invasive Plants Field Guide. Everyone who is attending today is eligible to receive a free copy. If you already requested your free copy this morning, that's the only one you get. You don't get two for attending both webinars. But if you didn't already request one, please send me your name and your snail mail address. We are mailing these out in the time of COVID-19 to my address there, nancy.olmstead@maine.gov. And I ask for your patience. It will take a little while. We're not in the office regularly, but we will mail you a copy of the Maine Invasive Plants Field Guide. This is a sort of a large pocket-sized field guide to the identification and control of 46 species of invasive plants. And there is a card for each plant showing key identification tips, and then a photo, and on the back side of the card, information about how to control it, as well as additional photographs. So it's a great resource for identification and control. And so if you didn't already request a copy by attending the webinar, we're happy to give you a copy of this field guide. So again, nancy.olmstead@maine.gov to request a copy of that guide. If you are looking to purchase additional copies, you can do that through the Maine Natural Areas Program website. And it's also available at a few local bookstores in Maine, COVID-19 permitting. So you might want to give those a call if you're interested in supporting a local bookstore. There's also, if you can't wait for your field guide to come in the mail, there's also our web gallery of invasive plants that has identification and control information for about 20 invasive plants, some of the more common ones in Maine, as well as some sort of early management or early detection priority species. And if you do a web search for invasive plant photo gallery Maine, this will be one of the top hits or the top hit. And this has the same information that's presented in the field guide and additional information. So we have some links on this web gallery, these web gallery pages to videos that talk about controlling the different plants and additional photos. So this is another resource while you might be waiting for your field guide or in addition to the field guide. I'd like to draw your particular attention to this plant, Tree of Heaven, which is an invasive tree. We don't have much of this tree in Maine as far as we know, and we're really seeking your help to find any locations of this tree. This is the host for a very destructive pest insect, the spotted lanternfly, an invasive insect. That's a bad news for many crops, including apples and hops and grapes and others. So we are looking for locations of this tree. This is a canopy-sized tree with very, very large leaves, compound leaves. You can see in this top right-hand photograph, these leaves are about 2 to 3 feet long. Yes, 2 to 3 feet long, very long compound leaf with many leaflets. These occur alternate along the stem, kind of one after the other as opposed to opposite. And the plants are frequent in kind of disturbed and open areas, roadsides, railroad tracks, abandoned lots. They're very opportunistic and can survive in many habitats. So if you think you know where any locations of Tree of Heaven are, please report these to me or into the iMaplnvasives tool, which I'll tell you more about in a minute. And if you want to learn more about this insect, I encourage you to search the USDA APHIS website for spotted lanternfly, and you will learn all about it. Luckily, we don't have this in Maine, the insect, but it is here on the East Coast, and we're very concerned about it. So please do report any locations of Tree of Heaven. A lookalike is staghorn sumac, which is more of a shrub, and it has a very fuzzy twig, and a sort of a pyramid-shaped cluster of reddish fruits, as opposed to these kind of elm-like clusters of samaras that are present on Tree of Heaven. So that's a lookalike that sometimes is confused. So once you can identify the plant, the next steps on your management are really to assess like what species are on your property, where are they, and about how much do you have? Those are kind of the key questions. And we encourage you to report the locations of plants into our iMaplnvasives tool. So iMaplnvasives online mapping tool is our central repository for invasive plant data in Maine. You're seeing here on the screen the aggregated numbers of records that are present across the state. So you can see that we have many records present in southern and mid-coast and central Maine, fewer locations from northern Maine and down east Maine. And obviously this represents to a certain extent our search effort, but we welcome your contributions. This is a free database. User accounts are free. It does run on kind of a sign-in system. So although you can see many records without a login, you'll see more different kinds of records when you're logged in, and you won't be able to enter records unless you are signed in. So we encourage you to get a sign-in account. And you know, looking at this tool allows you to see what invasive species have been reported near you, so you can perhaps stay ahead of it. And you can report plants that are on your property or on public property, like a town forest or a state park or national park, etc. We do ask that if you're on private property, you only report plants or species if you have landowner permission to do so, because this is publicly accessible. So we wouldn't want someone to learn about something by someone mapping it on their property without their consent. You can go to iMaplnvasives.org, and there's a big button that says log in, and if you click that, you can request your account there. I do have to sort of activate your account, so bear with me. It'll take a couple days. I mean, you'll be able to get in and do things, but you won't see all the full suite of record types until I toggle a switch. here is an example of a map that you could create in iMaplnvasives, showing, you know, what species you have where and about how much. So here you're seeing the pine lands, public reserve land in Gray and New Gloucester. This is a state of Maine property that I helped to steward with regard to invasive plants. And the pink areas there are from the conserved lands database that we have enabled as one layer in iMaplnvasives. And the green areas are showing the confirmed areas of invasive plants. And so, you know, with a map like this, I can share this with other land managers and make them aware of what's there, and also just highlight, you know, the areas that need treatment. So this is a way of getting an assessment of the property, you know, what we have, where, and about how much. So I encourage you to use this tool if it's useful for you. We're also open to your feedback on the tool. If you have any questions, please let me know. There's also a great help section on the iMaplnvasives.org website. The next step after you kind of have a sense of what you've got on the property is really to prioritize. And so there are various ways to do this. One way is to think about protecting your special habitats. So perhaps you have a lovely stream that goes adjacent to your property that provides great wildlife habitat, and you know that animals are using it as a travel corridor, and you want to make sure to protect that and provide good native plants in that area. That might be a section to prioritize. Maybe you've got some really valuable timber stands that you're thinking about managing, and you want to make sure that there's good advanced regeneration of your desired tree species in those stands. Or perhaps you're a recreational land manager, and there are some areas that receive heavy recreational use, and so you want those to be free of invasive plants so that people aren't accidentally moving them around out of those areas. Those are some examples of things that might be prioritized on a given site. Two things here: eradication of new species, so new to your property, or eradication of isolated populations. I would encourage those to be priorities, because when something is new, or if it's an isolated population, you have a much better chance of being able to tackle that and get rid of it for good. So eradication means to get rid of something hopefully for good, and it won't hopefully get reestablished. So that's a great goal if possible. You might leave for next priority suppression of really bad infestations or containment of larger patches. So as you think about what to do first, perhaps it's again protecting these special habitats, getting rid of species that are new to your property or that are only present in isolated populations or small populations. Obviously, if you have all the resources in the world, if you're not limited by resources, you can do all of these at the same time. But the reality for some land managers is that we have to prioritize. We can't do everything. And so how do we think about that? These are just some suggestions. Setting specific goals is also something I encourage people to do. Again, eradication, getting rid of something for good, that is a good goal, but it's not the only good goal. So containment, keeping something in the existing footprint, not allowing it to expand, that can be a really good goal. Exclusion, perhaps you have some kind of a natural barrier that separates part of a property from another, and maybe one part is not infested and the other part is. Well, if the other part that's really infested, maybe you don't have resources to deal with that, but you can monitor the part that's not infested and keep the plants from getting established in that area. That might be your best use of resources. Perhaps next year you might have resources to go in and suppress the bad infestations on the other part of the property. Suppress meaning restrict their ability to grow and produce seeds. So there's a lot of different ways you can think about prioritization and goal setting. So I encourage you to try to set goals and priorities so that you don't feel overwhelmed, because sometimes people, they call me and they're like, I don't know where to start. And I understand it can be challenging, but getting that, what species, where, and how much, getting that information, that assessment of the property can help you prioritize and set goals. So just some more examples of possible goals would be to reduce the extent, decrease the density, prevent seed production, keep vines from killing trees, so that's important for things like Asiatic bittersweet, or maintain access to infrastructure. So I know I work with like Department of Transportation and CMP crews and those kinds of power company folks, and they might have specific goals associated with their infrastructure. You know, I've seen like Asiatic bittersweet vines climbing up stop signs and telephone poles, and obviously, you know, those are a problem for our transportation infrastructure. And your goals may change over time. So that's called adaptive management. You know, perhaps there's a windstorm and it knocks over some trees in a part of your property that had previously been relatively free of invasive plants. Well, that disturbance could have created a great opportunity for invasive plants. And so you might want to spend more time in that area getting rid of any initially incoming plants to control that potential infestation. So after we prioritize, the next step is to actually get out there and kill some plants. We're going to actually control, and then we monitor and we repeat. So we'll get into more depth here with specific methods of control. But first, I'd like to ask the poll question about how are you managing invasive plants, and what methods are you using? So there's two questions, I believe, here that Pamela can launch. I'm going to take a sip of my water. Excuse me. Yeah, so the first question is simply, are you currently managing any invasive plants? Yes or no? God, you all are quick. We're up to 80% have voted. Please vote. Are you currently managing invasive plants? Great, thanks Pamela. So it looks like about 80% of folks on the call are currently managing invasive plants. Thanks for sharing. Can go ahead and launch the next question about what methods are you using? So if you're currently managing invasive plants, what methods are you using? And you can choose more than one. And of course, if you're not currently managing invasive plants, you can simply not answer this poll question. So it looks like we have about 83 participants, and so only about 80% of those said that they were managing. So if we can do some quick math in our head, we should have about 64 or so people who might respond to this poll. So we're almost there. It looks like 59 people have responded, or maybe I didn't do my math quite right. We're pretty close. Yep, there we go. Where's number 62, 63, and 64? Come on in. Great. Okay, so it looks like many folks are using manual. Almost everybody is using at least some manual approaches. Half of folks are using some mechanical approaches like mowing or brush mowing or weed trimming. And then we have lesser use of some other methods, but still about a quarter to a third of people smothering or solarizing with tarps or mulch, or use of herbicides. Lower use of grazing animals or flame weeding. Okay, terrific. Thanks everyone for responding to that poll. That's helpful for just me to get a sense of what folks are doing out there. Pamela, will we be able to save these poll results, or could you share them with me later?
I believe so. We can chat about that.
Great.
Afterwards.
Thanks very much. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to close that window and start diving into some of this control information. So there are many non-herbicide methods of invasive plant control. Mechanical methods, good old put, pull, cut, dig. Manual methods, so mechanical and manual, I use those somewhat interchangeably, but I think of mechanical as something mechanized. So like this little modified bobcat skid steer down there, dealing with brush mowing there, those woody invasive plants at the bottom. Smothering, such as with tarps, and we'll talk more about that. There are goats or other grazing animals. There's flame weeding, The baggy method, which I'll show you a photograph of, classical biocontrols, which are insects that are developed, tested very carefully, and released from the home territory of the invasive plant, so usually another continent. Those take a long time and have to go through very extensive testing. There's been pretty good success with the beetles for purple loosestrife control, and we are in progress with the biocontrol for black swallowwort, but haven't seen a lot of data yet about the effectiveness of those biocontrols, although tests are underway. They're working on biocontrol for Japanese knotweed, but don't hold your breath. It's still a ways away, and there are questions about how impactful the insect is on controlling Japanese knotweed. So those are some of the ones that I'm kind of actively monitoring. And in the Western United States, where they have other species like rangeland species, there are additional sets of biocontrols, like for some of the knapweeds. And of course, combinations. Combinations are really important. So often in invasive species control, invasive plant control, we're entering with multiple different treatments and repeating those over time. So I'm going to stress that, you know, think about more than one approach especially for, you know, more well-established, larger infestations. And I've got other here with a question mark, so please chime up in the chat box if you've got something else that's working for you that you'd like to share. I'm going to go through some considerations for various methods of control. And so when we're thinking about doing manual or mechanical control, we just want to be aware of where we're working, because shoreland zoning rules in Maine, if you're near a water body or a wetland, come into play with regard to removal of vegetation. And so you want to consult with your town code enforcement officer. There are exemptions for invasive plants in the statewide shoreland zoning, but towns can have more restrictive ordinances. So it's important to consult ahead of time with your town code enforcement officer when you are within the shoreland zone. You know, the goal is to prevent erosion, and it's an important goal, so we need to be aware of that. The Department of Environmental Protection also might be needed to be consulted for permits if you're disturbing soil near a water body or a wetland. So they also are concerned with removal of large-scale kind of removal of vegetation, but particularly if you're disturbing the soil, because again, we don't want to cause unnecessary erosion into our water bodies. Replanting and site stabilization can be really important to consider on large sites. You can see this photograph at the lower right. There's a lot of soil disturbance and a lot of area that's being exposed here. And so without some kind of a replanting plan, you know, that could get filled up with additional invasive plant species. So we need to be thinking about the long-term plan on sites where we're really creating a lot of disturbance. Native plants will, you know, hopefully if there are native plants around you, they will recolonize and can go a long way toward helping to get the site reestablished. But you might need to consider, you know, a combination of replanting if you're in an environment where most of what's around you is invasive material. So on the top right here, you're seeing the black plastic of a buckthorn baggie. And this is this is an actual product that someone sells, but you could make this yourself. It's just a small piece of pretty heavy duty black plastic in a bag format. And the idea is that you cut a stem of a woody invasive plant like a buckthorn or a, it works best probably on single stemmed things. So like if you have what else am I thinking of? Like a, sorry, brain tired, an autumn olive that has a single stem. You could cut that and then close to the ground, maybe leaving 6 inches or so, or 4 inches, and you want to place the bag over top of the cut stem, allowing enough plastic to flare out over the root crown so that you're not getting sprouting from the stem. And so the lack of light will reduce the stimulus for sprouting, and you can use a zip tie to sort of secure that to the stump. You know, I'm not endorsing this specific project, just sort of giving you an idea of a technique that might be useful in certain situations. So that's a little bit about how I think about manual and mechanical control and some, you know, sort of site conditions that are important to consider when embarking on large scale, particularly large scale projects or projects that are near water or wetlands. I want to say that you can do a lot with hand tools and a motivated set of folks. So this is my field team from last summer, Maddie and Jacqueline and Alice. And if you look closely, you can see that Jacqueline in the middle, she's holding her little pruning snips, and Alice too. They've all got their, well, Alice didn't wear her gloves, but the other two have their gloves on. And we can, you know, we can do a lot manually with our hand tools, with our loppers and our hand saws and our pruning snips. So don't underestimate the ability of a small group of folks to make progress over time. So I've been fortunate to be in my current position for 6 years, and I've been able to revisit and keep working on sites over time, sites that are owned by the state of Maine, and we've made progress. We do use herbicides at some sites, but we also do a lot of handwork, and it's really satisfying to see the progress over time from our efforts. You know, a shovel and some good old elbow grease on sites that are, you know, sparsely infested can go a long way. So I do a lot of manual control, and I encourage you to do it as you're able. I realize that, you know, this is easier for young folks than other folks, but you can accomplish quite a bit. Smothering and or solarization, these are sort of biologically slightly different, but you may get one with the other. This can be a good tactic. I'm going to talk about it specifically as it relates to Japanese knotweed, because that's often how I hear it discussed, but it could also be used for other herbaceous plants. We're seeing here at the top left a graphic from a publication done by my colleague from New Hampshire, Doug Sagan. He works for the New Hampshire Department of Agriculture, Markets, and Food. And he published a publication about preventing the spread of Japanese knotweed. And Pamela can share, or maybe has already shared the link to this publication online. And it talks about a lot of different things about knotweed, but part of it talks about this technique of smothering. And he's got a nice little diagram he made showing the cut Japanese knotweed stems in the soil down here. He's showing the black line for the black plastic or geotextile material. And you can, if you like, put bark mulch or wood chips on top. I've also heard reports from folks like these at the bottom right from Coastal Mountains Land Trust, who have used the geotextile cloth with staking. So you see that the gentleman here has a stake that they're going to use to secure the cloth into the ground, and then like rocks or blocks or something to help keep it in place too. And so the idea here is that you cut down the Japanese knotweed once it's grown to maybe waist high or so in a season, and then you apply the geotextile material. A plain old tarp is probably not sufficient for this. You need like a really heavy, thick fabric, the fabric that they use in road building is what they use successfully at Coastal Mountains. It's a thick, non-woven material. But I've heard people using old carpets. I mean, you know, if you just had a couple of tarps, you could start with that and see how it would go. And you place that over top of the knotweed, allowing it to extend, you know, 2 to 3 feet beyond the edge of the patch, so that you're totally covering and going beyond the edge of the patch, securing it down, covering it if you like. That's kind of optional. If it's in a high visibility location and you don't want to look at it, you could cover it. And then you have to maintain this. So this isn't like you put it down and you walk away. You have to maintain it. The Coastal Mountains volunteers were coming back every other week, and they were snipping away the knotweed shoots that would come out around the edges. So those root systems are very strong, and they will find the light. They will grow outward toward the light, and they will pop up, and you do need to trim those. And with knotweed, you have to be very careful with the trimmings. You can't just leave them there, especially if it's right by a stream or something. You need to collect those up and dispose of them if there's a possibility for them to be dispersed and bring the problem somewhere else, because knotweed can sprout from fragments of the green stem. So if it's a flat site, no water anywhere nearby, then perhaps you could leave them on the tarp and just let them desiccate and rot. And when they're dead, you're sure they're dead, then you could compost it, or you could just let them dry for a few weeks and burn them, or any of those kinds of methods. But if they're fresh and green, use extreme caution. Don't let those, blow away or wash away. So that's a little bit about this method. It can take a long time. I'm talking years. So some of the patches that Coastal Mountains was trying to treat were like 20 by 100. And they took 7 years of doing this faithfully throughout the growing season. Volunteers going every 2 weeks and clipping those shoots that come up. So this is not a method for, again, this is not a silver bullet, but it can work. And they have shown me pictures of great healthy native plants that have recolonized those sites. But it takes time, depending on the size of the patch and the age of the patch. So if you have a really small patch and it's only been there for a couple of years, you could hopefully get rid of this in a year or 2. If you've got a large patch and it's been there for a long time, this is going to take longer. So that's kind of the smothering method. Herbicide is another tool in the toolbox for some folks. I recognize that, some folks are just not interested in using herbicide, and you can put your fingers in your ears right now. Sorry, I don't mean to be dismissive. I recognize that not everybody is interested in using herbicide, and I'll just say up front, I buy a lot of organic food, and I want to differentiate carefully between the use of pesticides in widespread, kind of indiscriminate ways in agriculture, and the use of herbicide for invasive plant control. I really think that those are different things. And again, I don't mean to be, I mean to be careful and thoughtful about use of herbicide. There are many ways that we can use herbicides in combination with mechanical treatment so that we reduce the amount of herbicide that we use. And there are times when we choose not to use herbicide because there are other methods that will get the job done. So a couple of ways that we use herbicide. On the left here, there is the option for basal bark spray. And this is an option that has you treat the lower part of a woody stem, maybe 12 to 16 inches of the woody stem, and the herbicide is carried into the plant with an oil-based carrier and is moved throughout the plant in that way. So there's nothing to cut. You don't have to remove material. So this can be an efficient method. You do use a fairly concentrated herbicide product because you're not administering much volume of product. So it is a fairly concentrated product that you apply. And you can see that there's a dye being used in this example. Where's my mouse? There we go. So there's a blue dye being used here so that the applicator can know what plants have been treated and what plants are yet to be treated. On the bottom, I'm showing an example of the cut stem treatment. This is from a forestry site in the South. So, we don't do a lot of treatment of trees of this size, but just so you can visualize the method, you cut the plant and then almost immediately, within 30 minutes, you apply an herbicide, again, a concentrated solution to the outer cambium, the growing layer of the plant. So you don't need to, and it's not helpful to use the herbicide on the middle part of the stump because those tissues are not actively transporting the nutrients of the photosynthate down to the roots, which is what we need. So the herbicide can be applied from a bottle with a wicking sponge on the top. Please do not go out there with paintbrushes and open cups of herbicide. That is not appropriate. Get yourself an enclosed container from which you can safely apply the herbicide to the cut edge of the stump. This is a very targeted method, and it is a combination method because of course you've removed the above ground, the growing part of the plant, and so you've already knocked it back in terms of dealing with its resources. The foliar spray is another option. So in this situation, we're using a very low active ingredient percent, but we're covering the leaves of the plant. And you know, a sensitive applicator, a thoughtful applicator can be pretty targeted in terms of avoiding collateral damage, but there is the potential for overspray, and you do have to be aware of weather conditions. So that's some thoughts about herbicide. The label is the law. You must follow all the label rules. Special regulations apply near water and wetlands. You have to use careful timing because the different herbicides work differently. Drought can be a confounding factor here. So these are designed to work on actively healthy growing plants, and we don't want to use them at a time when the plants are stressed because the plants will not take up the product very well. Definitely you don't spray plants when they're flowering because beneficial insects could be visiting. So those are some rules of the road. Just looking at my watch and seeing already that it's 12 of 1. So moving right along, we've got goats. Goats are a really interesting tool. I just watched a webinar, and Pamela can share a link to hopefully where the webinar will be posted. It was just the other day, so it's not posted yet. But I think to sum it up, the use of goats really requires careful planning and professional help. So we're not just talking about letting animals loose. They're penned in special movable pens, and they're rotated through the site, and you have to know how many days they should be in your area. You need to know that goats remove above ground tissue only. So, you know, for long-lived perennial plants with hardy roots, this is part of a long-term plan. It's not going to be a silver bullet where the goats come once and the problem is resolved. They're fairly indiscriminate eaters. They will eat mostly woody vegetation. So they like to eat kind of at their head height or above, usually. You know, you have to think about the habitat type that they're in. So obviously there's going to be some animal feces, and you want to be careful that they're not getting into water bodies. So that's, you know, something you have to think about. And the plant species present and the size of the seeds is also important. There was a recent study done about the passage of seeds through the goat digestive system, and a review of literature about grazing animals passing seeds. And it found that goats effectively destroyed the seeds of buckthorn most of the great majority of the time. So that's reassuring. It wasn't down to zero. I mean, there was like, I think it was about less than 2% of seeds were still viable. So that's something to be aware of. And as seed size gets smaller and smaller, those numbers go up. So if you're dealing with a plant that has really, really, really small seeds, less than 4 millimeters, goats or grazing animals might not be the best choice unless they can be contained and the feces, you know, dealt with at a particular location after they're on the site. So that's a little bit about goats. They're really charismatic. So this could be a great PR tool and awareness raising tool on your site if you have a place where you can do some outreach and education about this. And I know that, you know, there are folks in Maine who've used this and who've been pleased with it. So it's part of a plan. It's not a one and done. And again, we're talking about a carefully controlled sort of situation here. Flame weeding with a propane torch is something that I must admit I don't know a lot about. So I'll just call out a few things. Fire has some serious risk potential, as all of us know. So careful attention to weather conditions are required, and you really need to consult your local fire authorities before you think about using this tool, because local municipalities might have concerns, or they might need you to speak with them to get a permit. So what I understand is that this technique is less effective on perennial woody vegetation with deep roots, because the idea is that you're really trying to kill the above ground tissue, like wilt it. Now on a woody plant, if you can damage the cambium all the way around, theoretically you could kill the plant, but that probably requires, you know, some special technique in terms of trying to do that. And repeated applications are probably needed even for, you know, some herbaceous plants that have long-lived roots. So I did find a Smithsonian Magazine article about this technique from 2016. It featured this woman, and I believe she was in Virginia or someplace like that in the mid-Atlantic, and she was trying this technique for one particular species. It didn't have a lot of conclusive results. I think the bottom line is I think it would be interesting to see more data about this technique and hear more from land managers who are familiar with it, but I'll put it out there as another potential opportunity. So invasive plant disposal, I get many questions about this. You know, what do I do with it? So ideally, you leave it on site. So this is one of our interns piling up some ornamental jewelweed. And some things to think about, you know, if it has fruit and seeds, obviously you want to treat that differently. You know, the fruit and seeds, when present, if possible, it's great to dispose of those, you know, with contractor bags and get them put into like the waste stream that goes to a landfill or to an incinerator. You know, you can cut off many seed-bearing structures and reduce the volume. You know, you have to plan carefully to do that as part of your treatment, but that is a potential. Can you render the material non-viable by drying it out on site? And then, you know, if it's like knotweed material, for example, as I discussed, if it's dry and dead, then you can, you know, dispose of it with the compost and you have more options. Volume, or how much you have, is often an issue. So, you know, in some sites we can find ways and places to pile this stuff. Obviously on some residential properties, that's more of a challenge. And then last but not least, you know, what does your town transfer station say? You know, what do they do with the materials? So please avoid situations where you're taking seed-bearing woody debris and the town transfer station is mixing it in with stuff that they're going to mulch and give to people as mulch. Obviously, that's not what we want to do. So, you know, again, sometimes we can time our treatments to work with the plant material when it's not seed-bearing. So that is an important strategy to avoid getting in a situation where you have that material. And so if you can use careful planning, you can avoid some of these bad situations where you've got a lot of material with seeds that you have a hard time disposing of. But again, ideally we leave it on site because the site is already infested. If we're carrying the material around, there's the risk of dispersal to new sites. So if you can leave the material on site. So most woody plants, invasive plants, if you pile them on site with the roots up, or you hang individual plants in the crooks of branches of trees and stuff, they're not able to reroot again if the roots are up and not in touch with the soil. So that is a good solution. And I've, you know, made piles in the woods, and those can serve some wildlife functions. So monitoring and following up is really important. No silver bullets. You need to treat again sometimes. Consider alternating methods and replanting with natives if it's appropriate. So, you know, here there's some not dead knotweed versus some truly dead multiflora rose. And so it's important to follow up. Okay, so I have another poll that asks if you're limited in how you are able to manage invasive plants, you know, what are those limitations? Again, I'm curious to hear from you. You know, how are you doing with this? If you are actively managing invasive plants, you know, how is that going? Are you able to address everything, or are you limited by funding or by lack of time or knowledge? And again, if you're not actively managing invasive plants, feel free to not respond to this poll. And maybe we'll just let this go for another 30 seconds or so. I've just only got about 3 more slides, and then we'll start going over questions. I haven't been following the Q&A, but I'm sure that there are many questions. All right, we're up to 50 people who've polled, and it looks like, you know, for some folks, this is just not a priority, or they're limited in terms of time. Some folks they don't know how to identify the plants. Others are limited by funding. So we'll give you another 10 seconds or so to respond if you'd like to respond to this poll. Looks like most folks probably have responded if they wanted to. Excuse me, I've got some allergies. Okay, thanks Pamela for being in charge of polling today. So folks who are limited in terms of what they're doing, it says, you know, not a priority for some folks, or their funding is restrictive, or they're not sure how to manage the plant. Thank you all for taking the poll. It's helpful for me to understand where folks are coming from. Okay, so I'm going to go through just, again, some resources that are available for helping you to control. And so the invasive plant field guide does have a control part for every plant. And I encourage you to read the managing invasive plants section, which is in the back of the field guide. I'm really proud of this section. I think it has summarized a lot of pretty detailed information on like 4 pages. So please read that when you get your copy of the invasive plants field guide. It's the purple section in the back. And I think it summarizes many of the rules and regulations and considerations in invasive plant management, I say. Another resource is a list of the licensed invasive plant control professionals licensed to use herbicides. So this is a list maintained by the Maine Board of Pesticide Control, and you can contact, if you're a provider, you can contact them to be listed. And I've got the link here, but if you do a web search for licensed companies, invasive plants, Maine, this will come right up. And so this is a resource for reaching out to someone who might be able to come and give you a quote to do the work on your property if you are interested in having herbicide used. If you are not interested in herbicide, or if you are interested in other techniques and potentially herbicide, we also have a list of non-herbicide or herbicide plus invasive plant control businesses that we maintain at the Maine Natural Areas Program. And if you know someone who provides this as part of their business, please encourage them to contact us to be listed. We certainly are always looking to add to this list of folks who offer various methods. And so you know, it includes the type of control that's offered and contact information and the areas served within Maine. Obviously, you know, some businesses are able to serve wider areas than others. So if you do a search for non-herbicide or herbicide plus invasive plant control Maine, you will find this list or find it from the Maine Natural Areas Program website. And that's all for today. This is my contact information. Thank you for attending. And Pamela, how about some questions that we can discuss?
Yes, absolutely. And I'll just say that we're just about at 1 o'clock. So if folks need to head out, please feel free to do so. I included a bunch of links which will be posted on the website later today. And you can reach out to Nancy or your local cooperative extension office if you have any questions. For those of you who can stay on just another few minutes, we'll try to answer a few of these questions. It's not too bad. Nancy, I'll start with the first one that came up a while ago. Linda is wondering how she can find out if, or excuse me, how she can find out how her town might be managing invasive species, especially Japanese knotweed in her street or neighborhood. What would you recommend for people who are wondering what's happening on the local level?
Sure. I encourage you to reach out to your public works department. So the public works department is typically in a town, the road crews and those kinds of folks who are out actively managing the roadways. And so your town office can probably get you in touch with them. And I see that Linda has also asked if there's a directive or state guidance on this for towns. We don't have anything specific like that. I did provide some material to the state of Maine Department of Transportation about best management practices for invasive plants in general. And I don't know to what extent they have shared that with local public works departments, but that's certainly something that we could make available if there's an interest. Yeah.
All right, great. And then Hillary is asking specifically about goutweed. I'm not sure if you see that question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do. Goutweed can be a difficult one, and yeah, if goutweed is growing right up against a stone wall, it can be challenging. I do not know the answer to whether metsulfuron methyl is specifically effective against goutweed. I would encourage you to read the label and see if that is a listed plant on the label of a specific product that has that. Yeah, that it can be tricky, but I think persistence is really the key there. Multiple methods and persistence, because it does have that long-lived rootstock. I see that Stephen has asked about the black baggy for Norway maple stems. I don't see why the black baggy would not work. I think you just got to make sure it completely covers the stem and the root collar. Some Norway maples have multiple stems at the base, so that could be challenging. But if it's a single stem, I think that would work. I'm getting into the Q&A now, Pamela, but if you have ones that you had flagged, please go ahead.
Yeah. So I'm wondering, for Tenley asking about volunteers helping with the iMaplnvasives, would that be a conversation you would want to have later with this individual?
Sure, Tenley, I'll make a note to reach out to you about that question. Thank you.
Okay. All right, let's see. How to deal most easily with heavy infestations of barberry? Any suggestions?
Barberry is very responsive to a foliar application of glyphosate at very low concentration. So, even below label recommendation, I mean, you can go very low, like 1% active ingredient or even 0.5% and still have pretty good efficacy. So if it's fairly, that's one technique that we have used on larger populations of Japanese barberry.
Okay, let's see. Sources and recommendations for replacement of native plants, reasonable costs for plugs and bare root plants in smaller quantities.
Yeah,
that's kind of a tough one.
It's a good question. So I'm gonna punt a little bit in that the Natural Areas program itself we don't have that horticulture expertise and connections. So the horticulture program within my department does maintain a website about native plants, and there are some links in there to resources. I think the more people ask for this kinds of products, the more they're going to become available in the marketplace. So I would encourage you to go to your local, your local nursery and ask for these kinds of products. I don't have like a go-to list, but the horticulture program does maintain some lists of businesses, and you might try contacting the horticulture program. They might know kind of who's developing that niche of kind of the native plant bare root plug thing.
And there are a lot of local nurseries or organizations that do kind of smaller native plant sales. I would just check out what's available in your town. Unfortunately, I can't recommend specific businesses or organizations, but if you just ask around locally, you can usually find a pretty good resource.
I'm going to recommend here also getting in touch with your local soil and water conservation district. Many of them offer plant sales, and they're well connected within their county or counties that they serve, and might be able to point you in a couple directions.
Great. In addition to that, I'll say that some native gardens throughout Maine sometimes offer native plant sales, so those are good options for you to consider. Let's see, next question. How do you know for sure when pulled roots stems are dead? I leave them in the sun for a long time, but afraid they could still be viable.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think if the material becomes brittle and it's easy to snap, that is a good sign. Yeah, there's probably not one answer to that question. It probably depends on the plant and how healthy it was when it was pulled. So I would just use caution and err on the side of leaving it out longer. I've pulled some bittersweet roots and left them on my driveway, and within a couple of weeks they look pretty desiccated and dead to me. So that's just some anecdotal information. I don't have a scientific study that provides that answer, unfortunately. But yeah, I guess I would say err on the side of caution and try to break the material. And if it seems to be brittle and fragile, that's a good sign.
Right. And then Linda was asking, what is the best method for pulling Japanese knotweed? Should you dig up the root base? Should you just pull the stems? Should you not pull up due to the increase of output by the plant?
Yeah. I think pulling for Japanese knotweed is probably only effective for really small patches where you can really closely get in there and try to make sure that you get a lot of the pieces of the rhizome, and that you can inspect the area and make sure you haven't accidentally let some piece of it loose. I have pulled, but again, for really small patches. For larger patches, I think I would use a cutting approach if they're still pretty modest in size, or some combinations. I see that there's a question about, can herbicides be effective? Yes, they can. So you can do a foliar application of a low concentration of glyphosate on Japanese knotweed, and that's fairly effective.
All right, I think we've gotten through quite a bit of these. Some people threw out some suggestions for nurseries or organizations. And then the last thought here is from Krista asking for ideas or suggestions on loosestrife.
Yeah, you know, some loosestrife plants are quite large, so digging them out with a shovel is a good approach if you're not in a sensitive habitat, or if there's just one or two plants. And you know, repeated cutting can also be effective for purple loosestrife. So those are some of my go-to.
Great. And then any other options other than glyphosate?
I'm not sure if that's specifically in response to Japanese knotweed or not, but yeah, I mean, there's several other kinds of herbicides, active ingredients. There's a triclopyr. There are various triclopyr herbicides that are used for invasive plant control. You know, some plants respond better to one herbicide than the other. I know, and then there are also considerations with regard to the applicator safety. So some of the triclopyr products carry stronger warning signals regarding exposure to the eyes. So you're kind of weighing, you know, the efficacy of the product against the potential risk in handling the herbicide. But in general, yes, there are other ideas, other products to be used besides glyphosate. I personally don't use some of the longer, what they call soil active herbicides or residual herbicides that remain active in the soil. We're trying to encourage native plants, and so we don't find them desirable. So like imazapyr or imazamox are active ingredients that are soil residual, and those are not products that we're using. Although, you know, they might have applications like in a roadside environment where they're trying to clear sight lines, but those are not products that I would recommend for invasive plant treatment. I see that there's a question about burning the stem of barberry. So I'm not sure whether that means like disposal. I think you certainly could burn barberry stems and roots to dispose them. In terms of like flame weeding, I actually so on State of Maine property, there's one location where there was some flame weeding of Japanese barberry and it wasn't very effective. And I'm not honestly sure whether that was because of the method of application or whether it's just many of the root crowns are quite large. They were large at that site. And I think it's a challenge to get all the way around and make sure that you've really killed the plant all the way around. So yeah, pulling is good. Thanks.
Right.
Thanks to Chris for chiming in about the way to help identify tree of heaven. It does have a rotten, bad peanut butter smell to it. Thanks for that tip. And thanks Pamela and Marjorie for sharing all those links, and everybody else for chiming in.
Yeah, I think I'm surprised we got through all the questions so quickly. Thank you so much, Nancy.
No problem,
what I'll do is
thanks for those great questions.
Yeah, so I'll go ahead and make sure I share some of these links that Nancy provided for us for today's talk on the website, and as well as the videos when they are available for uploading. And I'll send an email to everyone to notify folks when they're ready and available to watch if you missed them or know someone who missed them. I shared a kind of a last minute few resources there in the chat box if you're interested, but these will be posted. And thank you so much, Nancy, for offering this webinar. It was really great to have you.
Yeah, it was my pleasure. Thank you very much for hosting. I really appreciate your ability to get the questions and help people with the technology. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. All right, with that said, that concludes our webinar today. Thank you everyone for joining us.